So I was recently invited to contribute a piece for a true crime exhibition at a local gallery. As with most of my projects, this one began with a wooden base, which I thought would make a good place for legendary Australian bushranger Ned Kelly's last stand. To start with, I tore some cork sheets into pieces and glued them to the surface to add some elevation. Even though the site where this event actually took place was on mostly level ground, there will still need to be some variation in contours. I then added some celluclay, dirt from the garden, and in a totally unnecessary extra step, added some Tamiya texture paint. Then I painted the ground. By the time that this event took place, the Kelly gang was the subject of a major manhunt by the Victoria Police. They had been declared outlaws after an incident in which 3 police officers had been killed and subsequently went on to stage a pair of daring bank robberies. The hunt for the Kelly gang had been ongoing for months with nothing to show for it, and in July of 1880 the gang had decided to stage their most daring plan yet in the small town of Glenrowan. As a minor spoiler alert, I needed to add a log to this scene. To make this, I used a stick that I found in the forest and attached a few smaller splinters to get the shape that I wanted. The Kelly gang's plan had been to take control of Glenrowan, taking the entire population hostage and holding them in the local hotel. When a special police train was sent after them, the gang planned to derail the train and shoot any of the survivors. Since I wanted to have some authentic representation of the local flora, I asked an Australian friend about what sorts of plants grow in this part of the country. I quickly realized that I would be making some wattle. I decided on a golden wattle. To make this, I took some more sticks that I had found in the forest and I joined them together using pieces of wire. After connecting the branches together, I smoothed out the joints with milliput, and then to make roots, I put small pieces of wire into pre-drilled holes and built out the shape with milliput and green stuff blend. I then brushed some modeling paste over the entire tree to give the bark some texture. Next, I painted the trunk a brownish gray and started gluing on pieces of lichen for the leaves. At the time of year that this event took place, the golden flowers on the wattle would be in full bloom, so to simulate that, I used autumn leaf-colored flocking, which I glued on to the upper surfaces of the tree. It was now time to place the log and the tree on the base, and to add some flocking and static grass as ground cover. At this point, I was quite happy with how the groundwork looked, so it was time to start working on the figures. I liked the way that Ned Kelly's final shootout was portrayed in this contemporary engraving, so I decided to loosely base my diorama on this scene. To start with, I took a pair of Soviet and American torsos that matched the collar seen in this Australian mounted police uniform of the same era. Although in reality the officers at the scene all wore plain clothes, in this case I decided to have them wear uniforms because I felt that communicated more strongly that these men represented the long arm of the law. I wanted to have 2 officers, one taking cover with a revolver in his hand, and the other kneeling and firing a rifle. After matching the legs and torso of the first figure, I filled in the gaps and sculpted the lower hem of his tunic. Then I adjusted the way his arms were posed. By the spring of 1880, the police had engaged the Kelly gang in a years-long manhunt across Victoria and Queensland. Finally, after the murder of a former friend turned in police informant, the police knew where to find the Kelly gang and dispatched a train carrying a number of police in pursuit. As the train approached Glenrowan, they were warned by a hostage who had been released because the gang believed him to be a sympathizer, of which there were many in the region. From there, the police dismounted and approached the Glenrowan Hotel on foot. Now it was time to add his head, his haircut, and the hat. I opted to go with a kepi because I had seen several photographs of Australian mounted police wearing hats in this style. Since this did happen in 1880, I decided it was also appropriate to give him a nice bushy beard, which was the style at the time. For the second figure, I assembled and posed the torso, then sculpted the uniform in much the same way I had with the first one. After giving him a suitably Victorian facial hairstyle, I started work on his arms. To have him aiming his rifle, I borrowed a pair of arms from a U.S. airborne figure, reposing the left arm to allow him to be able to hold the stock convincingly. I then filled in the gaps at the shoulder and elbows. Of course, since he's a mounted policeman, I also needed to give him a pair of riding gloves. Now that both my policemen were sculpted, all that was left to do was paint them. After priming the figures, I started painting. At around 3 a.m. on the 28th of June, the police approached the hotel. As they moved forward, Kelly and his gang opened fire from the porch. After an exchange of gunfire, a brief pause in the fighting allowed some of the hostages, mostly women and children, to be released. Shots continued to be exchanged throughout the night and into the early hours of the morning. Now, I was ready to start work on Ned. I started with a pair of legs that looked like they would work, and then added a torso. The details here aren't too important, since they'll be covered up later by his armor. In preparation for the raid on Glenrowan, Ned Kelly and his gang built suits of armor that they forged in the bush using steel plates stolen from farmers' plows. To provide a bit of a foundation before placing the first armor plate, I filled in some space between his thighs to give shape to his steel apron. I used the same method to make all the plates for his armor. I rolled out some green stuff after allowing it to cure for about an hour, and then cut it into shape. After that, I put the piece in place. The hammer marks on the armor are clearly visible, so to get that texture, I used a silicone clay shaper. As can be seen on the actual suit of armor that Ned wore during the shootout, the breastplate was made from 2 pieces of steel riveted together. As a result, I decided to make the breastplate in 2 halves, starting with the right and moving to the left, and then making a cutaway to attach his arms. After cleaning up the edges, I used a small syringe tip to stamp the rivets into the armor. I also used a silicone shaper to add a couple bullet impact marks. Ned Kelly would later say that being shot felt like blows from a man's fists, something that any successful prizefighter would know a thing or two about. Since Ned's face was going to be covered by his helmet, I decided that he wouldn't really need it. It also helped to make a nice flat surface to lay the green stuff on when it was time to place his visor. I then wrapped some green stuff around his head and made a cutaway at the front for the visor. Then, with some milliput, I filled in the space below his chin and then smoothed out an indentation that had formed at the back of the helmet. As with the rest of the armor, I made the faceplate using rolled green stuff that I'd cut to shape. I then applied it to his face, leaving a space where his eyes would be. After that, it was time to try and make marks and indentations that matched the ones on the helmet he wore that morning. It was now time to start work on the arms. I wanted to have the right arm aiming a revolver in a stance I've seen in an engraving sketched by reporter Thomas Carrington, who was an eyewitness present at the shootout. The technique here was simple and straightforward. I took 2 different arms from other figures and cut them in half, taking the upper arm of one and the forearm of the other and joining them at the elbow. Ned had been wounded in the left arm during the initial shootout when the police had arrived at the hotel, so it made sense to simply leave it bent at a 90-degree angle and held close to the body. The next piece of armor to be made was going to be the big metal shoulder pads, or as people in the know call them, pauldrons. This part was going to be covered by his overcoat, but I still needed to get the underlying shape of them. I used 2 lumps of my usual blend of milliput and green stuff and formed them around the shoulders until they looked about right. The last bit of sculpting to do was Ned's overcoat. While almost all illustrations of Ned Kelly, including those made by Thomas Carrington, portray him wearing the coat with his arms through the sleeves, eyewitness accounts say he wore the coat over his shoulders. and indeed it would be difficult to imagine him getting those pauldrons through the sleeve of any jacket. The coat itself was made using sections of rolled green stuff which had been allowed to sit for about an hour after mixing. This gives the material some elasticity and enabled me to work with it in ways that would be impossible just after mixing. Once applied to the figure, I pressed the folds of the fabric into shape using a silicone shaper and my metal sculpting tools. After that, I attached the sleeves and sculpted the collar using a milliput and green stuff blend. The last step was to smooth out any irregularities with some milliput and water. Now, it was time to paint. For the most part, my process involved painting first with acrylics, followed by an oil wash. I opted to use dull metallic paints for the armor, since the real-life example had been forged in the bush using steel taken from stolen farm equipment. On the night of the siege, in the confusion surrounding the initial shootout, Ned managed to escape the hotel alone, leaving his brother Dan Kelly and fellow gang member Steve Hart encircled. Shooting continued intermittently throughout the night, until at dawn the police spied a strange figure approaching through the early morning mist. As eyewitness Thomas Carrington described the scene,
"With the steam rising from the ground, it looked for all the world like the ghost of Hamlet's father with no head, only a very long, thick neck. It was the most extraordinary sight I ever saw or read of in my life, and I felt fairly spellbound with wonder, and I could not stir or speak."
The gun battle lasted for about 15 minutes until Ned was brought down by a shotgun blast to his unarmored legs, as he was about to take cover behind a log. Ned Kelly was the only member of his gang to be captured alive, although he was seriously wounded. His armor had successfully stopped a total of 18 bullets, including 5 which had hit the helmet. After recovering in the Melbourne jail, he was sentenced to death by hanging on November 11th of 1880. His last words were, "Such is life." Ned Kelly was an interesting character, and as someone who likes to build stuff, I did find what he did to be incredibly admirable. This is an incredibly fascinating chapter in Australian history, and there are many important details that I had to leave out, although I tried to tell the story as best I could. It's a subject well worth reading up on. There's also a pretty good Australian miniseries about him called The Last Outlaw. I'll have some links in the description. I'd also like to give a special thank you to Christian Aldo, owner of the Super Wonder Gallery and host of the Plastic General YouTube channel, for inviting me to build this scene for a true crime show at his gallery in Toronto. Links are in the description. I'd also like to thank Jimbo, who helped with the research on local plant life and voiced Thomas Carrington. He also has a black metal band, and if you're interested, feel free to check out the links in the description. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how this project turned out. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did, and until next time, I'll see you at my next build.